7. Alberic woke up next morning with a thick head, a weary heart, and indigestion. He took a taxi to Taunton, only to find that he had missed the London train, and was faced with an hour in one of the dreariest towns he had ever come across in the course of a very long life. The only possible solution was a cup or two of strong, drinkable coffee, and he set off to find it. As he sat in a grimly coy coffee shop in Kingston Road, he tried to turn over in his mind the various courses of action still open to him, but found that rational thought was not possible in his state of health and the centre of Taunton. He gave it up, and as he did so became aware of a familiar voice behind him. "Really?" it was saying. "Nobody's worn that shade of blue since the 12th century. I couldn't go out looking like that." "You should have thought of that earlier," said another voice just as familiar. "You're impossible sometimes." The last time Alberic had heard these two voices, and the third voice that broke in to contradict them both, was in the depths of the Rhine about 1,000 years ago. He turned round slowly. "What are you three doing here?" he asked. Flosshilda smiled sweetly at him, with the result that the milk in his coffee turned to cream. "Hello, Alberic," she said. "How's the digestion?" "Awful. What are you doing here?" "Drinking coffee. What about you?" "Don't be flippant." "But that's what we do best," said Woglinda, also smiling. There was little point to this except pure malice, for Alberic had forsworn love, and was therefore immune to all smiles, even those of Rhine daughters. But Woglinda smiled anyway, as a sportsman who can find no pheasants will sometimes take a shot at a passing crow. "We're too set in our ways to change now." "What are you doing here?" "That would be telling," said Woglinda, twitching her nose like a rabbit. "How about you?" "Tourism," said Alberic with a shudder. "I like grim, miserable places where there's nothing at all to do." "You would," said Flosshilda. That, so far as she was concerned, closed the subject. But Woglinda was rather more cautious. "We're out shopping," she said artlessly. "Everyone's looking to Taunton for colours this season." "In fact," said Flosshilda, "Taunton is the place where it's all happening these days." She giggled, and Woglinda kicked her under the table. Alberic shook his head, which was a rash move on his part. "You'll find it harder than you imagine," he said. "You won't be able to trap him easily." "Trap who?" Alberic ignored her. "What you failed to take into account," he continued, "is his extreme lack of self-confidence. Even if he does fall in love with one or all of you, he's highly unlikely to feel up to doing anything about it. He'll just go home and feel miserable, and then what will you have achieved?" "We're not like that," said Woglinda. "We're good at dealing with shy people." Alberic laughed and rose to his feet. "I wish you luck," he said. "No, you don't," said Woglinda shrewdly. "Let me rephrase that. You'll need luck. Lots of it. See you in another 1,000 years. "Not if we see you first," said Flosshilda cheerfully. "Have a nice day." One of the few luxuries that Malcolm had indulged in since his acquisition of limitless wealth was a brand new sports car. He had always wanted one, although now that he had it, he found that he was rather unwilling to go above 30 miles an hour in it. The whole point of having a car, however, as any psychologist will tell you, is that it represents defended space, where no one can get at you, and Malcolm always felt happier once he was behind the wheel. There were risks, of course. Driving in Somerset, that county of narrow lanes and leisurely tractors, can cause impatience and bad temper, which Malcolm was duty-bound to avoid. Once his headache had subsided, Malcolm thought it would make a change to go into Taunton and look at all the shops. He had been an enthusiastic window shopper all his life, and now that he could afford to buy not only the things in the shop windows, but the shops themselves if he wanted to, he enjoyed this activity even more. Not that he ever did buy anything, of course. The habits of a lifetime are not so easily broken. For example, he stood for quite 5 minutes outside the fishing tackle shop in Silver Street, looking at all the elegant and attractive paraphernalia in the window. At least 2 rivers, possibly 3, ran through the grounds of the hall, and fishing was supposed to be a relaxing occupation which soothed the nerves and the temper. Not that he particularly wanted to catch or persecute fish, but it would be at least an interest, with things to learn and things to buy. For the same reason, he had a good look at the camera shop in St. James Street, and he had only stopped himself from going inside by reflecting that he had nobody to take pictures of, except perhaps the English Rose. He walked by the auction rooms and wondered who was doing his old job now. Inside there would be Liz, cataloguing something or other, and Philip Wilcox, training, not very energetically, to be an auctioneer. Again, he felt a strong temptation to go inside and look at them, and that would be perfectly reasonable since they both knew him only as the rich German who had bought the hall. He could now afford to buy everything in the sale if he wanted to, but the sale today was of antique clocks, and he already knew only too well how slowly the time passed. Besides, there was no point in buying anything for himself. It was, after all, only him, and he had no one else to buy things for. As he walked down North Street towards what passes for a centre, he noticed a shop that he could not recall having seen before. It was one of those art and craft places, selling authentic pottery and ethnic clothes, hence no doubt its name, Earthenware. But shops of that kind are always springing up and disappearing like mayflies in upwardly mobile towns, and Taunton is nothing if not upwardly mobile. In fact, as they will be delighted to tell you, Taunton is no longer a one-horse town. These days they have a bicycle as well. Entirely out of curiosity, since he was safe in the knowledge that there would not be anything in a shop of this sort that he could conceivably want to buy, Malcolm opened the door, which had goat bells behind it, and went in. The place was empty, except for a ghostly string quartet playing Mozart, a large cat asleep on a pile of Indian cotton shirts, and an astoundingly pretty girl with red hair sitting behind the till. As soon as Malcolm walked through the door, she looked up from the poem she was writing in a spiral-bound notebook with a stylized cat on the cover, and smiled at him. Malcolm had always been of the opinion that pretty girls should not be allowed to smile at people unless they meant something by it, for it gives them an unfair advantage. He now felt under an obligation to buy something. That presumably was why the owner had installed a pretty girl in the shop in the first place, and Malcolm did not approve. It was exploitation of the worst sort. "Feel free to look around," said the girl. Malcolm walked briskly to the back of the shop and tried to appear profoundly interested in beeswax candles. Although he had his back to her, he felt sure that the girl was still looking at him, and he remembered that he was the most handsome man in the world, which might account for it. A smirk tried to get onto his face, but he sent it away. He was, he assured himself, only imagining it, and even if he wasn't, there was bound to be a catch in it all somewhere. This was Taunton, not Hollywood. For her part, Wellgunda was rather dismayed. Either her smile had gone wrong since she checked it this morning, or else this young man was immune to smiles, which would be a pity. She had gone to the trouble of materialising this shop and all its contents just in order to be able to have somewhere to smile at the ring-bearer. A shop, the Rhine-daughters had decided, made an ideal trap for ensnaring unwary ring-bearers. Perhaps they had underestimated him, Wellgunda thought. Certainly, it had seemed a very straightforward project when they discussed it that morning. For all they had learnt about him, Ingolf's Bane was a foolish, sentimental and susceptible young man who would as instinctively fall in love with a pretty girl who smiled at him as a trout snaps at a fly. The only point at issue in their planning session had been which one of them should have the dubious privilege of being the fly. They had tried drawing lots, but Woglinde would insist on cheating. They had tried tossing for it, but Flosshilda had winked at the coin, and it kept coming down in her favour. So finally, they had decided to make a game of it. Whoever captivated the ring-bearer first would have to see the job through, but the others would buy her lunch at Maxim's. To make it a fair contest, they had materialised 3 shops in the centre of Taunton. It was a reasonable bet that no one would notice 3 shops suddenly appearing out of nowhere in the centre of town, for Taunton is like that, and it would be up to the ring-bearer to decide which one he went into first, and so who should have the first go. Wellgunda frowned. She was going to have to make an effort. "Are you looking for anything in particular?" she said sweetly. There was another potential customer outside, looking through the window at a selection of herbal teas. She turned quickly and smiled at the door. The card obligingly flipped round to read closed. Things generally did what she wanted them to when she smiled at them. "A present for my mother," Malcolm replied, amazing himself with his own inventiveness. "Does she like cats?" Wilgunda suggested. "Most mothers do." "Yes, she does." "Then how about a spaghetti jar with a cat on the front? Or a tea cosy in the shape of a cat? Or a little china cat you can keep paper clips in? Or a cat-shaped candle? Or a Cotswold cat breadboard? We haven't got any framed cat woodcuts at the moment, but we're expecting a delivery this afternoon if you're not in a hurry." "That's a lot of cats," said Malcolm, startled. "Cats and Cotswolds," said the Rhine-daughter brightly. "You can sell anything with a cat or a Cotswold on it, although some people prefer rabbits." She smiled again, so brightly that Malcolm could feel the skin on his face turning brown. He began to feel distinctly uncomfortable. "I'd better have one of those oven gloves," he mumbled. "With a cat on it?" "Yes, please." The girl seemed rather hurt as she took Malcolm's money, and he wondered what he had said. "If she doesn't like it, I can change it for you," said the girl. "No trouble, really." "I'm sure she'll like it. She's very fond of cats, and cooking." "Goodbye, then." "Goodbye." Wilgunda watched him go, and frowned. "Oh well," she said to herself. "Bother him, then." She smiled at the shop, and, just to please her, it vanished into thin air. Then she walked down the banks of the Tone and dived gracefully into its khaki waters. "Well," said one old lady to another as a chain of silver bubbles rose to the surface, "you don't see so much of that sort of thing nowadays." Confused, Malcolm turned up Hammett Street. It was not surprising, he said to himself, that a girl, even a pretty one, should want to smile at someone looking exactly like Siegfried the Dragon Slayer. And it was Siegfried's appearance, not his, that she had been smiling at, so really the smile was nothing to do with him. Besides, it was probably just a smile designed to sell cat icons, in which it had succeeded admirably. He felt in his pocket for the oven glove, but it didn't seem to be there anymore. He must have dropped it. What a pity, never mind. At the junction of Hammett Street and Magdalen Street, there was a health food shop, which had not been there yesterday. Of that Malcolm was absolutely certain, because he had parked his car beside the curb on which the shop was now standing. He stood very still, and frowned. "Did I do that?" he said aloud. "And if so, how?" He knew the song about the girl who left trees and flowers lying about wherever she had gone, but trees and flowers are one thing, health food shops are another. Either it had been built very, very quickly. After his recent experiences with builders at the Hall, Malcolm doubted this. Or else it had appeared out of nowhere. Or else he was hallucinating. He crossed the road and went in. "Hello there," said the bewilderingly pretty girl behind the counter. "Can I help you?" It was probably the dazzling smile that made Malcolm realise what was going on. "Hang on a moment, please," he said, and walked out again. Next door was a furniture shop with a big plate glass window. Fortunately, the street was deserted, and Malcolm was able to turn himself into the three Rhine-daughters without being observed. He found that he recognised two of them immediately. As an experiment, he smiled a Rhine-daughter smile at a chest of drawers in the shop window. It seemed to glow for a moment, and then its polyurethane finish was changed into a deep French polish shine. "That explains it," he said to himself, and did not allow himself to think that although that explained the smiles he had been getting, it did not explain the shops that had appeared from nowhere. Take care of the smiles, after all, and the shops will take care of themselves. He understood that the Rhine-daughters, the original owners of the gold from which the ring was made, were after him, and their smiles were baits to draw him to his doom. Not that there weren't worse dooms, he reflected, but he had the world to consider. Instead of walking away, however, he turned and went back into the health food shop. Now that he knew that the smiles were only another aspect of this rather horrible game that life was playing with him, and not genuine expressions of interest by pretty girls, he felt that he could deal with the situation, for he had a supreme advantage over the previous owners of the Nibelung's ring. He had no vanity, no high opinion of himself which these creatures could use as the basis for their attack. All that remained was for him to deal with them before they did anything more troublesome than smiling. "Hello again," said Woglinda. "Which one are you, then?" he replied, smiling back. Woglinda looked at him for a moment, and then burst into tears, burying her face in her small pink hands. Instinctively, Malcolm was horrified. Then he remembered Hagen, Alberic's son, whom the 3 Rhine daughters had drowned in the flood, singing sweetly all the while. "Thought so," he said, trying to sound unpleasant, but he had lost the knack. "So which one are you?" "Woglinda," sobbed the girl, "and now you're all cross." The Rhine daughter sniffed, looked up angrily, and smiled like a searchlight. A carnation appeared in Malcolm's buttonhole, but his resolve was unaffected. "You can cut that out," he said. "Oh, well," said Woglinda, and Malcolm could see no tears in her deep blue eyes. He could see many other things, but no tears, and the other things were rather hazardous, so he ignored them. "Where did the shop come from?" he asked. "Shan't tell you," said Woglinda, coyly frowning. "You're beastly, and I hate you." "Girls don't talk like that anymore," said Malcolm. 1,000 years ago, perhaps, but not in the 1980s. "This girl does," replied Woglinda. "It's part of her charm. You've been looking for a nice old-fashioned girl all your life, and now you've found one." Put like that, the proposition, accompanied by the brightest smile yet, was somewhat startling, and Malcolm turned away and looked at a display of organic pulses. "You've been to a lot of trouble," he said. "I spent ages making it all nice for you," said Woglinda. "I don't like health food, especially organic rice." "Oh, I'm sorry," said Woglinda petulantly. "If I'd known, I would have built you a chip shop instead." She checked herself. She was letting her temper interfere with business. "I still can if you'd rather." "I wouldn't bother if I were you," said Malcolm. "I expect you're sick of the sight of fish." "If you asked me to, I would." "Forget it, please. I know what you want, and you can't have it." "Usually that's our line," said the Rhine daughter casually. Malcolm blushed. "Oh, go on," she continued. "It's our ring, really." Perhaps the smiles had a cumulative effect. Malcolm suddenly felt a terrible urge to give her the ring. He had already taken it off his finger before he knew what he was doing, and it was only when he caught sight of her face, like a kitten watching a beetle it intends to eat, that he felt the sense of danger. He thrust the ring back on, so fiercely that he cut the skin between his fingers. "I can't," he said sadly. "I'd love to, but I can't. You wouldn't want it, really." Woglinda suddenly laughed, and Malcolm felt as if he was being smothered in gossamer, like a fly trapped by a spider. "Don't be silly," she cooed. "I'd like it more than anything in the whole wide world. I think you're mean." Again there was a hideous temptation to give in, so strong that the ring seemed to burn his skin. Malcolm could stand it no longer, and tried to command the Tarnhelm to take him away, but his mind could not issue the order. The smiles had got into it, as light gets into the photographic film, and blurred all the edges. "Stop that!" he shouted, and Woglinda winced as if he had slapped her. He tightened his hand around the ring, and her face seemed to collapse. Suddenly, she was not pretty at all. She looked like a 1,000-year-old teenager who wanted something she knew she couldn't have. Then, just as suddenly, she was lovelier than ever, and Malcolm knew that she had given up. "Sorry," he said, "but there it is." He turned and walked out of the shop, trying not to look back, but the urge was too strong. When he did look back, however, the shop was gone. He had won this bout then, but was that all? It would probably be unwise to go swimming for a week or so. After the fight, Malcolm needed a drink. He walked swiftly up Cannon Street, heading for his favourite pub, but it wasn't there anymore. Instead, there was one of those very chic little wine bars that come like shadows and so depart all over England. He had a horrible idea that he knew where this one had come from. The wine bar, Le Cochonnet, was empty except for a quite unutterably pretty girl behind the bar, tenderly polishing a glass. "You can put it all back, exactly as it was," said Malcolm sternly. The girl stared at him in amazement. and for a moment Malcolm wondered if he had made a mistake, but he looked at the girl again and recognised the third Rhine-daughter. There couldn't be two girls like that in the world, unless he was very lucky. "So which are you?" he said. "Wogunda or Flosshilda?" "Flosshilda," said the girl carelessly. "You've met the other two?" "That's right." He held up his right hand, letting the light play on the ring. "I'm not going to give it to you, either. It's not a toy, you know." Flosshilda studied the glass in her hand for a moment. "All right," she said, "if you insist. Would you like a drink?" Flosshilda had been rather proud of her wine bar, and it was with great reluctance that she had agreed to change it back into the French horn, but she did so with a smile. "Won't the landlord and customers be a bit disoriented?" Malcolm asked. "Not really," said Flosshilda. "All I did was change them into chairs and tables, and they won't have felt anything. For some reason, when I smile at people and change them, they don't seem to mind." "I can understand that," said Malcolm. "Let me buy you a drink." "I'll have a babycham," said Flosshilda. "No ice." When he returned with the drinks, Flosshilda leaned forward and whispered, "Your Liz is over there in the corner with her boyfriend, that one you threw in the water." "So what?" said Malcolm coldly. "She's not my Liz." "I could turn him into a frog for you if you like," whispered Flosshilda, "or I could smile at him without turning him into a frog. Your Liz wouldn't like that at all." "I'd rather you didn't," said Malcolm. "I'm not allowed to be malicious anymore." "That sounds awful." Flosshilda seemed genuinely sorry for him. "Would it count if I did it?" "Probably. But it's kind of you to offer." "Any time. I might just do it anyway. I don't like him. He's stuffy. I don't like stuffy people." "I'd better be careful then," said Malcolm. "I've become very stuffy since—" "That's not your fault," said the Rhine-daughter. "I shouldn't be doing this," said Malcolm, fraternising with the enemy. "I'm not really the enemy, am I?" Flosshilda smiled, but it wasn't a serious smile, just a movement of the lips intended to convey friendliness. Malcolm was intrigued. "I mean, you're not going to give me the ring, and why should you? That doesn't mean I hate you." "Doesn't it?" "Course not." Well, Glinda burst out crying. "She does that," said Flosshilda. "She's very bad-tempered. I'll tell her to leave you alone." "Would you?" Malcolm felt a strange sensation at the back of his head, a sort of numbness. He hadn't chatted like this to anyone for a long time. "Are you staying in England long?" he asked, trying to sound uninterested. Flosshilda grinned. "If you like. It's the same for us, you know. We're all in the same boat. Of course, I've got the other two for company, but you know what it's like with sisters. They get on your nerves." "I know, I've got a sister." "Then we'll be company for each other," Flosshilda said. "I mean, we can go for drives in the country, or maybe take a boat up the river." Malcolm remembered Hagen, and said he didn't like boats. "Won't your sisters mind?" he added nervously. "Oh, bother them," said Flosshilda. "Besides, I can tell them I'm working on you." "Will you be?" "You'll have to wait and see," said Flosshilda, carefully not smiling. "Now, why don't you buy me lunch? I'm starving." Malcolm drove back to Coombe Hall in a rather bewildered frame of mind, and nearly rammed a flock of sheep outside Bagborough. Over lunch, Flosshilda hadn't mentioned the ring once, except in passing. She knew some very funny stories about the gods, especially Wotan, and seemed to be making no effort at all to lead him to his doom. That, of course, might simply mean that she was being subtle, but Malcolm had taken the precaution of reading her thoughts, and although he knew that one shouldn't believe everything you read in people's minds, he had been rather taken aback by what he had found. Of course, it was possible that she had deliberately planted those thoughts there for him to read, but somehow he didn't think so. It seemed that Flosshilda had reconciled herself to the fact that the ring wasn't going to be given to her, and she didn't really mind. Instead, she rather liked the ring-bearer. Nothing more than that, but never mind. Nor was it simply his assumed shape that she liked. She had seen that shape before, when it had the original Siegfried inside it, and besides, she didn't judge by appearances. That, it seemed, was not the way these curious otherworldly types went about things, for in the world they inhabited, so many people could change shape as easily as human beings changed clothes, and so you could never be sure whether a person was really handsome or simply smartly dressed. Flosshilda, however, thought that she and the ring-bearer might have something in common, and she wanted someone nice to talk to and go out with. There had been more than this, but Malcolm hadn't read it. He was saving it up to read over lunch tomorrow.
"Well," said Woglinda, "and where have you been?"
"Having lunch," said Flosshilda, "at Carey's."
"But you haven't got it?" said Woglinda abruptly.
"True." Flosshilda lay back on the bed of the tone and blew bubbles. "But who cares?" Woglinda stared at her sister, who closed her eyes and let out a rather exaggerated sigh. "I think I'm in love," said Flosshilda. "Don't be ridiculous," snapped Woglinda. "You can't be. You aren't allowed to be." "Oh, all right then. I'm not. But the next best thing, or the next best thing to that. He's nice, in a quiet sort of way." "You should be ashamed of yourself," said Woglinda fiercely, but Woglinda smiled, confusing a shoal of minnows who happened to get in the way. "If it makes it easier for you to get the ring," she said softly, "then you go ahead." "I'm not interested in the silly old ring," yawned Flosshilda. "It's supremely unimportant." Woglinda nodded. "Of course, but it would be nicer to have it than not to have it, now wouldn't it?" "I suppose so. And there's no point in your liking him if he doesn't like you." Flosshilda made a vague grab at a passing roach, which scuttled away. "I don't know, is there? And if he likes you, he'll be pleased to give you the ring now, won't he?" "I don't know and I don't care," replied Flosshilda. "We're just good friends." "You've only met him once," said Woglinda. "There's no need to get soppy." "There's every need to get soppy. I like being soppy. What's for dinner?" "Trout with almonds," said Woglinda. "Not fish again." Woglinda perched on the edge of a broken wardrobe, one of many that furnished the riverbed. "Nobody says you shouldn't make friends," she said gently. "But what about us? We want our ring back." "Once you've got it back, you can be friends with who you like," said Woglinda, inspecting her toenails. "Though, personally, they need doing again," she added. "There's something nasty in this river that dissolves coral pink." "Oh, be quiet, both of you," said Flosshilda angrily. "I'm sorry I told you now." There was silence at the bottom of the tone for a while, with both Flosshilda and Woglinda sulking. Finally, Woglinda requested Woglinda to ask her sister Flosshilda if she could borrow her coral pink nail varnish, and Flosshilda asked Woglinda to tell her sister Woglinda that she couldn't. "Be like that," said Woglinda. "See if I care." Flosshilda jumped up and floated to the surface. "Now look what you've done," hissed Woglinda. "You've offended her." "She isn't really in love, is she?" asked Woglinda nervously. "That would be terrible." "I don't think so. She's just in one of her moods." "What'll we do?" "Don't worry," said Woglinda calmly. "Leave her to me."